Hello everyone, my name is Maxim. Welcome back. Today we will be covering the dim hypothesis by Leonard Peikoff, which is a method effectively for predicting the future of philosophy by identifying the most basic causal factors operating in the past in philosophy. So he undertakes a monumental project, and I think it's a great work of integration, which incidentally is exactly what we're going to be discussing today. So I intended to do this about 6 months ago, but the theory is quite complicated and I didn't want to present it until I had quite a strong understanding. With that said, it's possible that I could still be mistaken on a few small points. And I've made a list of things that I explicitly chose not to cover at the end of the presentation, if you would like to know what those are. And of course, I'll put a link on how to get the book yourself. I hope you enjoy. So, The Dim Hypothesis is a book that offers a framework to analyze the philosophical underpinnings of societies by categorizing their cultural trends. And it categorizes them into three basic categories. And as we'll see, there are five categories which can be derived from those three. So those are integration, that's I, disintegration, D, and misintegration, M. What do each of these mean? Well, integration, it's a psychological process. It's the process of identifying the one in the many, and we'll get into that in a bit more detail. But it's about finding the harmonious and logical interconnections of knowledge and ideas, and this is required to arrive at a rational, objective view of reality. Disintegration is the refusal to do this, not merely choosing not to do it, but being against doing it. So this means we do not find the one in the many. We have a many without a unifying one. And misintegration is trying to find the one in the many, but doing so invalidly and thereby separating the one from the many. We'll get into what all this means in a lot more detail shortly. Now, Peikoff argues that the way a culture goes, historically speaking, is determined by the basic outlook on integration that the cultural creators in that culture have. That will, of course, determine what the culture will be in the future. Before we get into any more details about the dim hypothesis, I'd just like to introduce the author Leonard Peikoff. Leonard Peikoff, as of the time I'm making this video, is living. He's, I think, 90 years old. He's a prominent objectivist philosopher, and he developed the dim hypothesis. I believe the book was published in 2012, to assess the impact of philosophy on culture and history. He posits that a society's approach to integrating knowledge, or failing to do so, determines its overall health and direction. Peikoff emphasizes the importance of philosophical principles in shaping societal values, institutions, and advancements, and he stresses in the book the need for a rational, integrated approach to knowledge, warning against the dangers of the two modes that are invalid, so that is misintegration or disintegration. The first mode is integration. So let's examine this in more detail. Integration is the process of logically connecting knowledge to form a coherent and non-contradictory understanding of reality. In addition to being coherent and non-contradictory, it also has to be empirically valid. It has to relate to the real world. If you have something that is only coherent but doesn't relate to the real world, then that's misintegration. So integration involves organizing knowledge hierarchically, ensuring consistency with observed reality, that's the empirical side, and logical principles, that's the, let's say, the logical, rational side. So integration fosters scientific and cultural advancements by unifying various observations and theories into a comprehensive understanding. Now, in an integrated society, that is, a society where the intellectuals advocate an integrated view, and this is these ideas are taken by cultural creators, and we'll explain what that means soon, and practiced and rational products are created in the culture, such as in literature, in physics, and so on, then this society will flourish. It will be aligned with the principles of reason and individual rights. So we see that, we'll see what type of society that would look like later. So as I said earlier, in very simple terms, integration is finding the one in the many and doing so correctly and validly based on reason as well as experience. Now, Peikoff discusses the big three philosophers, and they are Plato, Aristotle, and Kant. Each of these are fathers of one of these approaches to integration. So we're starting with Plato, who is the father of misintegration. I actually got AI to create this piece of art here, which is supposed to be Plato's head and a castle in the air floating above it. It's floating and only very tenuously connected because the abstractions he builds up don't ultimately come down to nature, to the world we observe. So Plato's philosophy emphasizes ideal forms over empirical reality. So what's really real are these forms. We have to detach ourselves from the world and go up the forms until we get to the form of the good, and then from there on everything else will make sense. So this requires detaching yourself from reality, and there's this sort of sublime journey to understand the perfectly rational forms. So his theory of forms asserts a higher, abstract realm of truth. This truth is separate from perceptual experience, and in fact, percepts, according to Plato, can only serve to remind us of concepts, but ultimately percepts are a distraction. They're an illusion. So of course, there's Plato's cave. I actually did a lecture on Plato in the History of Philosophy course, if you would be interested in finding that. So Plato was the most influential philosopher in history, is the most influential philosopher in history, because he was the first system builder. And he built a system and he identified the importance of conceptual life in human thought. And for this, he can be praised for identifying the importance of the conceptual realm. But he must be condemned for separating concepts from percepts, for separating thought from reality. Now, Plato exerted an influence on the Middle Ages, and this led to a synthesis of his ideals with religious dogma, prioritizing mystical or idealistic. By idealistic, I don't mean having values and moral ideals. Idealistic here means the opposite of materialistic or naturalistic. So idealism means concepts create reality, not reality gives rise to concepts, as in naturalism. So idealistic concepts over empirical observation. Now, what does this misintegrative approach achieve? Well, it has repercussions in all fields. It affects an entire culture. When an entire culture is practicing misintegration, that is, when the intellectuals in a culture advocate a misintegrative view and separate concepts from percepts, we see this reflected in everything from literature to science. And it is, of course, ultimately destructive, and we'll look at why that is the case. Now, Aristotle, if Plato is the father of misintegration, then Aristotle is the father of integration. So that is validly, correctly identifying the one in the many. Now, Aristotle was influenced by Plato, and there is unfortunately a Platonic element in his philosophy, but it is not the basis of his philosophy. His philosophy stresses the importance of starting with what we see in the world around us, starting with the senses, and then building up to higher order concepts, checking at each point that our concepts are aligned with reality. So Aristotle's emphasis on empirical evidence and logical reasoning established the groundwork for integration. He advocated for the unity of knowledge, as did Plato, but empirical observations, according to Aristotle, must be integrated into a coherent system of concepts, not be detached from them. So Aristotle's influence during the Renaissance led to a resurgence in scientific inquiry, arts, and human-centered politics, all reflecting an integrated understanding of reality. So, according to Peikoff, Aristotle made philosophy secular for the first time. That doesn't mean he rejected the idea of a god. He actually did have an idea of a god, but it was nothing like the Platonic kind of god. For more information on that, you can watch my lecture on Aristotle. So in an Aristotelian framework, each field, from physics to politics, is approached by systematically connecting percepts to form rational concepts. So this is finding the one in the many, rather than a one detached from or floating above the many, as we saw with the castle floating above Plato's head. So here I have Aristotle. This is, of course, AI generated. But what I wanted to represent was nature on one side and reasoning and thought on the other. And it's the case that the mind is in the middle. The mind is what creates the concepts from perceiving reality. And that's what this is supposed to represent here. Now, finally, we have disintegration, and Kant is the father of that particular approach to integration. So Immanuel Kant, if you'd like to know more about Kant, you can listen to my lecture on Kant from several months ago. Kant's philosophy, particularly his distinction between the noumenal and the phenomenal worlds, initiated the modern era of disintegration. So Kant posits that humans cannot know the thing in itself, the noumenal reality, and suggests that a fundamental disconnect exists between perception and reality. He does this through a very complicated process involving 12 categories and the distinction between pure intuitions and sensory intuitions, and it's a very complicated epistemology. And again, you can go to my lecture on that for just an introduction to it. But as far as the dim hypothesis is concerned, disintegration is the approach to knowledge which rejects the idea of finding a one in the many. So here we have Kant, represented by this artwork that I got AI to generate for me, of him just smashing science to pieces. I asked it to show him bringing a sledgehammer to a chemistry lab or something like that. And so that's one thing it generated. I thought it was quite funny. So this disintegration can be seen in contemporary trends in literature, politics, and education, where subjective experiences are often emphasized over objective truths. So let's move on to what the hypothesis itself is in Leonard Peikoff's words. Quoting now from page 71. By what means do philosophical abstractions gain and exercise their power over people? One possible answer, the one I wish to explore, is that such abstractions gain their power through their influence in shaping the mental, integrative processes of cultural creators. The processes then govern and so are reflected in the creator's products. This kind of influence can be real and sometimes epochal, even if many creators themselves do not know its deepest source. Thus, the full definition of a dim category, a mode of integration derived from philosophic fundamentals that, when it guides a cultural creative process, leads to a product recognizably reflecting it. So this passage identifies the connection between abstract philosophic ideas and how those are practiced in a culture. It's not the case that ideas come directly from philosophers to the public. The public, for the most part, doesn't have any interest in philosophy. They come to the public very indirectly. They're first interpreted by intellectuals that are closer to the perceptual level than philosophers. So I suppose philosophers would be pretty much as abstract as you can get as far as professions go. When they create revolutionary new philosophies, primarily the big three, Plato, Aristotle, and Kant, and which are then interpreted by philosophers who may also be brilliant, but are not as original as Plato, Aristotle, and Kant. So philosophers such as Hegel, who interpreted Kant, or Thomas Aquinas, who interpreted Aristotle, or Descartes, who was a Platonist, a better version of a Platonist, but nonetheless a Platonist. These, let's say, second-tier philosophers, not in a derogatory sense, just in the sense of originating ideas, bring the ideas closer to the perceptual level, but still are very high above it. What is the bridge between the public and philosophers? That is cultural creators. So artists, the four fields we'll cover are literature, physics, education, and politics. Those are the four fields that Peikoff analyzes, but there are many fields, of course, that bridge philosophy with the real world by creating more concrete products. So, for instance, literature creates a book. That book would have a certain philosophy implicit in it. If it's to be a great book that will have some kind of cultural influence, it will have a certain philosophy. And that philosophy can be classed as fundamentally D, I, or M, disintegrative, misintegrative, or integrative. And how does the author decide which it's going to be? They don't decide this consciously, usually. What Peikoff is arguing is that they decide this subconsciously based on the culture that they get their information from. And therefore, they produce a piece of art or science that fits that approach to integration. Now, I'm going to continue reading page 71 and 72 to explain the hypothesis in two very simple points. So Peikoff writes, quote, "Now at last I can present the dim hypothesis, which is in fact two related theses. The first may be described as cultural, the second as historical. A. The cultural thesis asserts that, since the Greeks' development of philosophy, cultural fields in the West have produced up to 5, but no more than 5, essentially different kinds of products, defined by their mode of integration. In other words, the dim categories exhaust the alternatives in Western culture." Okay, makes sense. Now, B. The historical thesis asserts that the West's mode of integration has changed several times across the centuries, and that this has occurred not by chance, but in substantial part because of the logic of modal progression. If we can gain an understanding of this logic, therefore, we will have a basis for rational prediction about the West's future. So, there is a degree of predictability to modal progression once you understand this dim idea. That's what Peikoff is trying to convey in his hypothesis. Now I'd like to move on to the 5 modes. As I mentioned, there are 3, D, I, and M. But D and M each have 2 versions. There's M1 and M2, and D1 and D2. I does not have 2 versions, because I is integration, and there's only one correct way to integrate. So there is a section in the book which discusses why the Aristotelian approach, the integrative approach, which only has one serious error, which was later corrected, not by Aristotle, why that approach can only have one variant. So let's now discuss M1 and M2. So these are the 2 different forms of misintegration. Now, this is a little bit complicated, but M1 is distinct from Plato's M2 because Plato tries to separate the one from the many completely and deny the metaphysical significance of the many. M1 is trying to approach M and trying to integrate it with I. Now, he talks about 2 philosophers who tried to do this, Descartes and Spinoza, in page 48 and 49 of the dim hypothesis. So in M1, we still have a priori knowledge. So a priori is prior to experience. It's the knowledge that cannot be reached through direct observation. So this is still very un-Aristotelian. In any case, Descartes holds we have these a priori axioms and we can deduce certain truths from them. But how do we know that the truths align with perceptual reality? And the answer the M1 gives is they align with perceptual reality because God sees to it that they do. And God, being such a moral and perfect being, wouldn't create us and then make us unable to have our intellectual intuitions align with reality. He would make sure that our deductions do align with reality. not because our senses are somehow valid in any strict sense, but just because our mind would be so ordered by God as to correspond to the facts of nature. So that's the M1 approach. It's basically a more innocuous version of M2. So it doesn't separate the natural from the supernatural completely the way that Plato does. It actually allows for the alignment of the natural and the supernatural through the intermediary, which is God or something of the supernatural kind. So according to this, knowledge is possible. Certain knowledge is possible, as in not that certain types of knowledge are possible. We can be certain about knowledge, but there is a supernatural entity at work making this the case. Spinoza offers a different definition for M1, which Peikoff calls M1. Spinoza is similar to Descartes in the sense of supporting what Peikoff calls M1, but he does not base his idea on God's goodness, but on a very comprehensive rationalist system. And this is a system that Peikoff calls worldly supernaturalism. So it's deliberately a contradictory name for it because it is a mixed mode. So that's M1 is the mixed mode. M2 is the consistently M mode. Now let's look at D1 and D2. So D2 represents the extreme form of disintegration, which requires nihilism. Nihilism means the valuing of nothing at all, means having no goal, believing in the inherent worthlessness of life and of, in this case, knowledge. So D2 is nihilism, where even the validity of percepts is questioned. So not only is our mind invalid to integrate the one in the many, but even the many that we perceive are also invalid. So it's taking a hammer to philosophy and smashing everything into pieces. D1 characterizes a form of disintegration where skepticism prevails. It doesn't mean simply that we reject all knowledge in the way that, in the sort of way that Kant did, but we're just very skeptical. And we allow limited integrations. We allow a few percepts to be integrated into a concept and a few concepts to be integrated into a higher order concept. But we never allow for the full conceptual unity of knowledge. That would be I if we were to do that. Because after all, we can question our percepts and we can never be fully certain of anything. This is the kind of culture that Peikoff holds we are in today. So skepticism prevails, often seen in postmodern philosophy, where the connection between percepts and overarching concepts is denied. In both D1 and D2, the fragmentation of knowledge results in a disjointed worldview, impacting everything from education to politics, where coherent, unified policies are hard to establish. If you would like just an example of what we're referring to here, think about how children are educated in modern Western schools. The ones in the much more progressive modern tradition. They're taught about concrete subjects and not given a particularly strong base in fundamentals in, say, mathematics, in the skill of writing, in articulating themselves. So these modes demonstrate the challenges faced by societies that embrace disintegration, leading to a lack of clear direction and purpose. In physics, integration, the I would be Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics bridges the gap between empirical observation and universal laws. So it uses a valid process of scientific induction to figure out things like, say, the law of gravitation. So this exemplifies the Aristotelian influence on science in establishing a coherent understanding of physical phenomena. So that would be an example of I in physics, Newton. What's an example of D in physics? Disintegration. Well, quantum mechanics. If you've ever discussed quantum mechanics with someone who has some knowledge of it, they will tell you something that amounts to a confusion between the metaphysical and the epistemic. So they'll tell you something like, we don't know which side of the nucleus an electron is on at any given moment. It's everywhere at once. Well, that's a perfect example of disintegration. They are taking very complex integrations, such as the idea of atoms and so on, which cannot be perceived directly, and then telling you that this leads to some kind of disintegrated science. Just because we don't know where the electron is doesn't mean the electron is everywhere within a given area or it isn't there. It just means we don't know, but it is somewhere. There is an answer to that question. In any case, quantum mechanics, especially interpretations that emphasize uncertainty, such as I was just discussing, and the limits of knowledge, reflects Kant's influence in separating percepts from concepts. So that's an example of D in physics. Now an example of M in physics is medieval alchemy. So we're all trying to find the elixir of youth, or whatever it is they were trying to find, the philosopher's stone. And this is just magic. It's the one without a many. It has no basis in objective reality. So that's an example of misintegration in physics. Let's look at literature now. Integration in literature would be Romanticist art, epitomized by Victor Hugo, also epitomized by Sophocles in ancient Greece, because both the Enlightenment era and the ancient Greek period were predominantly I cultures, integrated cultures. So in the context of literature, I represents individualistic pursuit of values in a rational world. That's what an I writer would write about. What would a D writer write about? A disintegrative writer? Well, that would be postmodern literature, under the influence of Kant. Often focuses on the subjective experience and fragmented narratives, and I should have added in there, of completely average people. It does not stress values, it does not stress what ought to be and should be, but simply what is, and usually in quite a derogatory sense. It misses out on a rational, unified reality, almost gives a journalistic account of what happens in some random character's life. The perfect example of D in literature would be James Joyce, who Peikoff mentions. Now, M in literature would be, say, medieval literature shaped by Platonic ideals that use allegories to convey religious and idealistic themes. Idealistic here, of course, means non-naturalistic, that is, that consciousness somehow has metaphysical primacy over physical reality. So this M approach disconnects narratives from empirical reality. Now, education. In education, an example of integration would be education in the Enlightenment era, drawing on Aristotle, advocated for an educational system that integrated diverse fields of knowledge, emphasizing empirical evidence and rational thought. So in the Enlightenment, the idea was knowledge is one system. Everything that's true is connected to everything else that's true. And our goal as human beings on Earth is to discover all these truths so that we can maximize our potential and fulfill the objectives of human life. What was the approach? What's the modern approach? The modern approach to education is definitely a D approach. It's not I and it's not M, it's D. So contemporary educational systems reflecting Kantian thought often promote subjective interpretation over objective knowledge, leading to fragmented learning. This is the point I mentioned earlier. I don't think I need to give any examples. You can just walk into the average high school or even primary school to see this, and you can walk into the average university to see it. Now, misintegration in education would also be the scholasticism of the Middle Ages, just like we saw before with literature. So influenced by Plato, misintegration in education would often feature a one without the many. So religion, which is not true, but it floats above reality, doesn't pertain to reality, and anything that occurs in the physical world is pushed into the religious paradigm. Anything that happens is just happened because God willed it to happen. And that's the explanation given for everything. So that's a perfect example of misintegration in education. Now let's look at politics. Politics is probably the easiest field to see this at work in. It's the easiest to understand. and everybody has some exposure to the field of politics because it's unavoidable to have that kind of knowledge. So integration in politics would also go back to Enlightenment ideals. The Enlightenment era was an I era, according to Peikoff, was an integration era. And perhaps the seminal achievement of that era in politics was the founding of the United States, the Declaration of Independence, and the US Constitution. This was all based on individual rights within a structured constitutional framework, and it was, of course, informed by Aristotle. John Locke was mentioned by the Founding Fathers in many correspondences between them as an ideal to strive toward in terms of what type of political system is suited to rational people in a rational universe. What's an example of disintegration in politics? Well, since we are today in a D era, we will see that modern politics is disintegrated. Modern political movements lack a coherent ideological foundation, and this results in inconsistent and contradictory policies. So you'll notice whenever there's a political election, there's always a debate over who should get what from who. Who should get what from who? How much should we tax people? Who should the taxes go to? Should we put it into healthcare, or should we put it into the military? Should we put it into education? And so on. This is a perfect example of disintegration, because whenever such discussions come up, nobody asks, what is the philosophy on which we will decide who gets what from who, and even how the system should work? No politicians, and certainly none of the political commentators, beyond the very philosophical ones who nobody listens to, make this kind of argument. Now, an example of misintegration in politics, of course, would be theocratic regimes, which draw on Platonic and religious ideals, often impose a singular ideological narrative, disconnecting political systems from the reality of their societies. This is very easy to see in the last century. We had the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany. These are M systems. M does not mean that you have to have religion. It can be religion without a god, so that wouldn't normally be called religion, but the idea is exactly the same. It doesn't matter whether what you're fighting for is the Christian god or the Islamic god, or the Aryan race, or the proletariat in Soviet Russia. All of these just take the form of the high ideal that is detached from reality, that has no basis in reality, and to which we must all strive at the expense of our own lives, our own happiness, and of course at the cost of great destruction to ourselves and to others. So if you'd like an example of a modern misintegrative approach to politics, you can look at North Korea, where Kim Jong-un is the god, or you can look at Iran, where the Ayatollah Khomeini, I think is their name, so the religious leader is effectively the god as far as the regime is concerned, or at least the interpreter of God's word that we must all listen to. Those would be two examples of M in politics. But the modern West is clearly D in politics. Now, this is all quite complicated, so thankfully for us, Peikoff includes a graph at the back of the book, a chart like this, which I have transposed into digital form. There's the chart, and it's there. So it tells you which culture, which dates, what the literature was like, what the physics was like, what the education, the politics were like, and then the final mode. And you'll see the mode corresponds to all the fields. So let's look at Greece from, say, 500 to 300 BC. This is the time of Plato and Aristotle. Literature was Homer. Physics was the scientific method. Education was all about rational self-fulfillment, and in politics they had democracy. These are all the products of an I mode, of a rational I mode. Then we had the collapse in, let's say, the Middle Ages. Then we had M2, so that would be the collapse of a rational Greek approach to the world and descent into Christianity and barbarism. We had Dante in literature, Physics was no longer scientific, it was all about divine teleology. Education was not about the self and about being rational, but about instilling Christianity. And of course, the politics was totalitarianism. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the Middle Ages as a culture and Eastern and Central Europe, the very last row, there's a very strong similarity. Not in literature and physics, because literature and physics were modernized by then, but if you look at education, the Middle Ages was instilling Christianity. The modern East and Central Europe up until 2000, so up until 1991 or so when the Soviet Union collapsed, was instilling communism. And in politics, both eras were totalitarian. Now, if you look, you can also see where we are. We are in the second last row. So that's if you live in the modern West, you belong to the second last row here. The date's 1900 or so till present. In literature, non-objectivity. In physics, quantum mechanics. In education, progressivism. And in politics, egalitarianism. We're all the same, we're all morally equal and so on. That's the idea of egalitarianism. And the mode is D2. You might argue that we're partly D1, partly D2, and there's truth to that too. So I'd like to discuss the achievements of the dim hypothesis. So the dim hypothesis provides a comprehensive framework to analyze and predict the philosophical, cultural, and historical trajectory of societies. It emphasizes the crucial role of integrating percepts into coherent concepts for societal advancement and warns against the dangers of disintegration and misintegration. Through its analysis, the dim hypothesis offers insights into the underlying philosophical causes of historical and contemporary cultural trends. The hypothesis has been instrumental in understanding the interplay between philosophy, culture, and history, offering a predictive tool for future cultural developments. So, what Peikoff has done in this book is look through all of history, Western history, going back to ancient Greece when philosophy was created. Looked at 4 distinct fields, found what the products had, identified the basic underlying factor, the latent and unexpressed, up until this book was written, unexpressed factor, uninvestigated factor that underlies all of Western history, namely our approach to integration. He identified that, and then identified the 3 basic approaches and the 5 sub-approaches to integration, D1, D2, M1, M2, and I. And then looked at how we've moved and what caused the shifts from one era to another. And you'll see ultimately what causes the shifts is, are we basically Platonic? Are we basically Aristotelian? Or are we basically Kantian? So what caused the Renaissance? Thomas Aquinas' revival of Aristotle. What caused the Middle Ages? The Platonic influence, which took off well after Plato had died. What caused our current disintegration? Well, according to Peikoff, it was Immanuel Kant's influence. And it's not necessarily Kant directly. It was his followers, such as Hegel. And, of course, Hegel was the precursor to Marx, who was the precursor to 20th century communism. So I'd like to continue on the achievements of the dim hypothesis quickly and offer some more personal thoughts. One thing I love about this book is that it is the exact opposite of what today's books that Peikoff would call disintegration books do, which is focus on minutiae and some little detail. This is an entire analysis of Western history at the highest possible level of abstraction without leaving out crucial details, that is designed to find a factor that has never been identified before, and using that factor, firstly testing that that factor is indeed predictive, and then using that to predict the future of philosophy. So each of these fields and each of these modes represents the identification of the one in the many. So this is a great work of integration in contemporary literature, I think, the dim hypothesis, and for that reason I think it's an excellent book. And of course, Peikoff identifies a culture's basic approach to integration as the cause of what is found in the cultural fields and as a predictive mechanism. So, what we have, I've put it as 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5 modes, D1, D2, M1, M2, and I. 4 fields, physics, literature, education, and politics. 3 approaches, integration, disintegration, misintegration. 2 possible outcomes for a society. So those possible outcomes are either we advance towards a rational, integrated understanding of reality, or we decline into confusion and contradiction, that would be the D alternative, or we fail a different way. So there's actually 3 outcomes, but basically there's 2 in the sense of good or bad. Both M and D would be respectively decline to confusion, contradiction for D, and the worship of something outside of reality and beyond us as M at the expense of our lives. So those are the 2 possible outcomes. Either it's one of those 2, or we progress into a rational, integrated view of the universe in service of our life. And 1 outcome. Something must happen next. So the question is, what happens next? Before I get into what happens next, which I think is what everyone's looking forward to knowing, certainly I was, I'd like to just quickly cover what we didn't cover today. And these are all the things that if you want to know, I recommend you just buy the book. So what we did not cover, just because of time constraints, was the technical details of the process of integration and concept formation. So he discusses at length what constitutes valid integration and what constitutes invalid integration. I'll just give one example. The concept extremism is a concept, but it's not a valid concept. It's not valid integration. He uses it as an example, and I'll explain why. When we integrate, we're finding the one in the many. We're finding the common factor among a hypothetically unlimited array of percepts or lower order concepts that have some basic essence in common. Those are my words, not his. Now, extremism is basically a derogatory term for people who hold strong and uncompromising ideals, but it doesn't specify the nature of these ideals. So the content of the beliefs that they hold is actually left out of the definition of the concept. So, for example, an extreme advocate of statism and dictatorship versus an extreme advocate of freedom and reason would both be considered extremists by the concept, even though they could not possibly be any more different. So this is why it's an example of invalid integration. If you'd like to know more, and I know you have questions, as I said, please buy the book. You would be doing Leonard Peikoff a favor, you'd be doing yourself a favor, and you'd be doing the world a favor, especially if you choose to spread the ideas as I am doing. So we also didn't cover the 2 mixtures, that is D1 and M1 in any detail. So D1 is knowing skepticism, of course a deliberately contradictory name for it because it is a mixed mode, it's not consistent, and worldly supernaturalism we touched on, which is M1, also inconsistent, but these are the slightly more innocent versions of D and M. We didn't cover the Platonic influence on Aristotle, which led to a serious error in how Aristotle formulated concepts. This error was later corrected by Ayn Rand, who made quite clear what Aristotle's error was, corrected it, and then the Aristotelian approach would become fully I. Just quickly though, if you're interested, the error was that he thought the form of something was actually in the thing, rather than a mental unit which was designed for human cognition only. If you'd like to know more, you know what to do. I didn't discuss Peikoff's analysis of the 4 fields and the historical periods, which of course is the majority of the book. So the majority of the book, he looks at different historical eras and how literature, education, physics and politics played out over those eras and how that provides evidence for the dim theory, the dim hypothesis. And finally, we didn't cover alternative approaches to historical and philosophical analysis and the problems with those non-dim approaches. Now, without further ado, let's see what's next. This is the name of a chapter in the book, the final chapter. What's next? And I'm going to read from the book. This is page 333. It's quite ironic because that's half of 666, which is quite telling. What's next? Quote, religious totalitarianism in America. That is my prediction. God is dead, said Nietzsche in the 19th century, to which a recent book title gives the 21st century reply, God is back. Still quoting, there is nothing to stop M2. In surveying Western history, we have found 6 factors, one or more of which is necessary and sufficient to produce modal downfall and replacement. These are, quote, the instability of a mixed mode, the inability of the establishment philosophically to defend its mode, modal rebellion by the intellectuals, modal rebellion by the public, knowledge of an acceptable alternative mode, and triggers. As applied to the United States today, the compromise of the mixed D1 mode falling apart is reaching the end of its road. The Ds of both kinds, through their disdain of philosophy, have turned it into their own greatest liability. No new philosophy has emerged to inspire rebellion by the intellectuals who are committed to the status quo. But there are many signs of public rebellion led by men who know and approve only one alternative mode. It's funny, when he writes about the men who know and approve of only one alternative mode, that is, of course, M2, there's one person who comes to mind who I consider certainly perfectly representative of this M2 being brought to the public against the D1 intellectuals, and that is Jordan Peterson. He's very popular in the public and not so much in academia, and he is bringing the M2 mode into full force in the public sphere, which I do not regard as a good thing, of course. Now, Peikoff goes on to write about triggers. So what will be the final straw that actually pushes a free country like America, at least partly free country, which is now in a D1 mode, into an M2 religious totalitarian mode? I'm quoting here again. The final straw could come from anywhere. It might be moral outrage over some establishment-blessed anathema, such as a ban on teaching creationism in public schools, or a decree that in the name of equality hotel rooms must stock not only the Bible but also next to it the Torah and the Quran, or a close presidential election generally considered to be rigged against a religious candidate by secular media widely thought to be a mere arm of a secular government. I could go on. He gives many examples, and it's very interesting. Now, he likens the decline of modern America to the fall of Rome, but he does point out some differences. I won't go into too much detail now, but suffice it to say, the outlook for the United States is not good, according to the dim hypothesis. So, I suppose here it's good to ask, is there still hope? Now, in the last few pages of the dim hypothesis, Peikoff asks, do we have hope to save Western civilization from collapsing into a M2 mode, into the M2 mode, which is, of course, Platonism? Well, he says there's barely any hope, but there is a little bit, and it all depends on whether the I mode, the integrative approach to epistemology, takes off. Quote, if there is a race between M2 and I, it seems one side, M2, will have an almost insuperable advantage. skipping ahead. The evidence of another better outcome, however, even though the Enlightenment's legacy is visibly shrinking, is still there. Almost insuperable entails can still be defeated, and no one so far can remove the almost. Now, this is getting to my favorite quote in the book. The high probability of a monstrous evil should not induce paralysis in those who see it coming. It should lead not to the end of action, but to the beginning. The worse the coming future, the more it should motivate its opponents. The more it should strengthen their passion to defend themselves and their values against the approaching onslaught, even when the odds of their failure are high, so long as there is still a chance for success. If your beloved is strolling unwittingly toward the edge of a cliff, and you are so far away that even if you run at top speed and scream at top volume, you will very probably not be heard. Even then, you do not give up, shrug, and ponder the tragedy of existence. Not if you really do love her. For every moment she is still alive, you keep on running and screaming, however much your lungs and your throat have turned to fire. You do it because rescue is possible, barely possible, but still possible. In most cases in life, the probable outcome by definition is the one that occurs, but not always. Across the ages, men have on occasion been able to achieve a cherished goal, even when facing seemingly insuperable odds. The greatest Western example of this took place fittingly in ancient Greece. In 480 BC, in the Battle of Thermopylae, 300 Spartans, led by King Leonidas, repulsed for 3 days hundreds of thousands of barbaric Persian invaders led by Xerxes I. During the 3 days, the Spartans were killed to the last man, but their indomitable character won out. The Athenians had been given enough time to prepare for and later defeat the enemy in a historic naval battle. Against incalculable odds, the Oriental mystics had lost, and Western civilization, which would otherwise have been strangled in its cradle, had been saved. Today the odds we face are about as lopsided, but at least our weapons are stronger. We can repulse the enemy not merely with spears, but with that which ultimately moves the world, ideas. So, thank you everybody for listening to this lecture about the dim hypothesis. I know we were not able to cover even 90% of the book, but I hope I gave a very brief outline, and I hope that if nothing else, you read it. So, on another final parting note, I do have some upcoming events in 2024. I'll be running several philosophy-related projects. There will be more information on that available soon. I will be doing a course, it might be 2 parts or it might be 4 parts long, on the philosophy of longevity, the science and philosophy of longevity. And I'll be doing some other bioethics-related videos as well. You can reach out to me via my website, maximbishev.com, if you'd like to get in contact. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.